Welcome to Spiritual Calisthenics. Christ is in our midst. On October 3rd, we commemorate St. Dionysios the Areopagite, as well as St. Rusticus and St. Eleutherios the Martyrs, and St. John the Chozebite, Bishop of Caesaria. Regarding St. Dionysios the Areopagite, this saint was from Athens, a learned man and a member of the famous judicial court of Mars Hill, in Greek, Areopagos, hence the name Areopagite. Now, this area on Mars Hill was a place where philosophers would gather. So you've heard the expression, "ending on a soapbox." So they had a big rock. This was in front of the area of the Acropolis and all of the various temples. This is one of the reasons why St. Paul, when he preaches about the unknown God, this was an area where all the people were gathered for thought. And so Dionysios and others would have gone there to expound upon wisdom, and so he was considered a philosopher. When St. Paul preached in Athens, he was one of the first there to believe in Christ, and according to some, became the first bishop of that city. Others say, and this may be more probable, that he was the second bishop of Athens after St. Eleutherios, whom Dionysius calls his friend and teacher after Paul, who St. Dionysius references in his work Divine Names. With St. Eleutherios, he was also present at the Dormition of the Most Holy Theotokos. The doxastikon of the apostica of the service of the Dormition is partly taken from a passage on chapter 3 of Divine Names. According to ancient tradition, he received a martyr's end, and according to some in Athens itself, about the year 96. Since thou hast been instructed in uprightness thoroughly, and was vigilant in all things, thou wast clothed with a good conscience, as befitteth one holy. Thou didst draw from the chosen vessel ineffable mysteries, and having kept the faith, thou didst finish a like course, O higher martyr Dionysios. Intercede with Christ God that our souls be saved. In spirit thou didst pass through heaven's gate, instructed by the great apostle, who attained to the third heaven's heights, and which was made rich in all knowledge of things beyond speech. And then thou, O Dionysius, didst illuminate them that slumbered in the darkness of their ignorance. Hence we all cry out, Rejoice, O universal Father. Now, before we get into the readings, I have to unload some things. First, St. Dionysius is one of my favorite saints, particularly because he is the father of apophatic theology. Now, what is apophatic theology? Apophatic theology is the opposite of cataphatic theology. So kata, according to, an apa, from. So the idea is that cataphatic theology is making statements of positives. So God is this, God is this, God is this. Apophatic theology is making the opposite, saying God is not this, God is not that. Basically saying, okay, let's take away things, let's carve away the idea. So for example, God is light. He is not the light bulb that is over my head. But apophatic theology is useful to us because it allows us to be able to understand God. The reality is that we're finite, we're human. We cannot possibly understand the divine cosmos. It is beyond our scope, it's beyond our ken. There's only so much our human brain can take in, and God is beyond all of that. So, where does apophatic theology comes in? It comes in analogy, comes in metaphor. And so, for example, God is Father. He's not my dad. However, through my relationship with my Father, I'm able to understand the concept of fatherhood. And so we are able to take that further. God is love. And we can use that for all the different kinds of love, whether it's eros, philos, agape. God is love. He is not my spouse. However, through the love of my spouse, I can understand what it means to have that kind of all-encompassing love for a singular individual. And so this is how this is made. And so St. Dionysius made this analogy in looking at the idea of Moses when he was put into the cleft of the rock. When Moses asked to see the glory of God, God told him, you can't. No man can look upon the face of God and live. It's beyond us. But what he did was he put Moses in the cleft of a rock, put his hand over that cleft, and as he passed, he removed his hand so that Moses was able to see God's back. Now, this analogy, St. Dionysius called blessed darkness, that it is in the darkness I am able to see you because the light is too much. So in the shadow of the hand, I'm able to contemplate and understand God. And so Dionysius wrote a great many books on divine names where we see the understanding of this apophatic theology put in full force. We also see celestial hierarchy in which we are led to understand the orders of the 9 angels. It's another reason why I love St. Dionysius, because he enumerates them in a perfect way for us to understand. But there's also other elements to Dionysius. So Dionysius has a theology that is very, very good for the allegory, and it's very, very Neoplatonic. The idea of understanding the good and how the good comes down and we're supposed to return to the good. Problem with this, and this is where things get a little bit dicey, is that a lot of the passages in St. Dionysius's works look like carbon copies of the works of Plotinus. Plotinus lived in the 3rd century. So we're talking a full 200 years after the time period that his works would have been written, almost word for word. And Plotinus is the father of the Neoplatonism movement. So there were many, many, many philosophers that would have been studying under Plotinus that were part of this. Much of Greek thought is contextualized within the Neoplatonic understanding. This was the birth of a renaissance for philosophical thought within orthodoxy. And so this is very, very important to us. But what does that tell us? It tells us that the language and the verbiage are almost identical to Plotinus, it is almost assured that the author of these books that we ascribe to St. Dionysius the Areopagite would have been written in the 3rd or 4th century, because they would have been showing us that this person was a direct disciple of Plotinus. Now, why would that person that was a couple of centuries after the fact write his name as Dionysius, the 1st or 2nd bishop of Athens? Well, it is so that that person's writings would actually have claim. So this person, whoever it was, took themselves out and said, you know what? I'm not important. What's important is the thought. What's important is what I'm writing down. And so even though I am not Dionysius, I'm going to write that I'm Dionysius so that people actually read my work. And so this was most likely what was happening. Now, fathers of the church, in their wisdom and mercy, have merged the two together into a singular person, in which we say, oh, no. This is still the same person, and his writings were written when they were written, and it worked out somehow that they sound very similar to Plotinus. This is one of the reasons why in some textbooks you will see it called pseudo-Dionysius, in as much as there is no way that it was actually written by Dionysius. Now, lest we get too caught up in this, we have to understand that many of the works of St. Paul are also called into question within the New Testament as to whether or not St. Paul actually wrote them, or whether it was somebody pretending to be St. Paul in order for it to be understood. So for this, we're not going to get a firm answer. However, what's important for us is what St. Dionysius wrote. These are very, very important for our salvation. The person of St. Dionysius, whether he wrote these or not, is very, very important to us. And it is salient to us that he was present at the Dormition of the Theotokos and was one of the first 2 bishops of Athens, where a lot of philosophical thought and Christianity really blossomed. And so we celebrate this great saint, regardless of whether the saint's writings came from the 1st century or from the 4th century. From Acts of the Apostles. In those days, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogues with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who chanced to be there. Some also of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers met him, and some said, "What would this babbler say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he preached Jesus and the resurrection." And they took hold of him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is which you present, for you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now that's the interesting thing about the Greeks during this time, as opposed to a lot of philosophers nowadays. Nowadays, people, they know what they know and they don't want to know what they don't know. Meaning that the idea of rhetoric seems to be dead. The idea of arguing or debating. These people, even though they thought this guy's probably crazy, out of curiosity, they want to hear what St. Paul has to say. And so they ask him, "Come tell us. Tell us everything about what you have." Because they love learning, they love knowledge. Even if it wasn't something that they were going to ascribe to, they still wanted to hear it so that they could understand it. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time in nothing except telling and hearing something new. So Paul, standing in the middle of the Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, To an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you, that God, who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, as he himself gives to all men life and breath, and everything, and he made from one every nation of men to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their habitation, that they should seek God, in the hope that they might feel after him and find him. Yet he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets have said, we are indeed his offspring. Meaning that St. Paul is taking from the Greek the idea of trying to understand the universe, also understanding that we are children of gods, as it were. So he's using their language. St. Nectarius of Aegina calls this the expectation of the nations, that St. Paul is utilizing a tool that Christendom is going to use thereafter, in which we look to the culture, we look to the stories, we look to the histories, the mythologies of a people, and we use that as a hook to bring them to us, to Christ, to be able to talk to them about Christ. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, a representation by the art and imagination of man. Times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all men by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, We will hear you again about this. So Paul went out from among them, but some men joined him and believed, among them Dionysios the Areopagite, and a woman named Martyrs, and others with them. So St. Dionysios the Areopagite is considered one of the first Christians of Athens to follow after Christ through St. Paul. The Gospel according to St. Luke. At that time Jesus stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of all their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured, and all the crowd sought to touch him, for power came forth from him and healed them all. And he lifted up his eyes on his disciples and said, Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you that hunger now, for you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you that weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when men hate you, and when they exclude you, and revile you, and cast out your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. This gospel, which is typically read for confessors and those that have suffered for the faith, is telling us that when we suffer for Christ, we will rejoice, that all of our sadness will turn to great joy. Jesus Christ, who is the personification of the Beatitudes, Makarios, blessed is the man. This comes from the very first psalm, which begins with Makarios Uanir, blessed is the man, shows us that all of our struggles will bear fruit, and that all of the things that we think are not going to come to us will come to us. When we are sad, we will be happy. When we are hungry, we will be filled. Not necessarily with earthly things, but with the divine, the everlasting things that are of much more value and will never fade away. I hope that you've enjoyed today's Spiritual Calisthenics. Have a blessed and wonderful day.